Hi, I'm Dr. John Alchemy with RateFast, and I'm here today to talk to you about data integrity and understanding the foundational clinical data in impairment reports. Remember, in California, when an individual who's had a work injury reaches maximal medical improvement, also known as MMI, the doctor is required to deliver to the stakeholders a permanent and stationary report called a PR4 report, and that has to be done within 20 days. And what we're going to talk about today is the data integrity of impairment reports. This is not something you will hear about very often, even if you're into workers' compensation, if you're an adjuster, if you're an attorney, a judge, an injured worker, a doctor, for instance. It doesn't get talked about very much, but it's very foundational to the quality and the determinations and the findings of an impairment report. That's why I wanted to talk about it. Data integrity is actually something that RateFast has pioneered. We've been using it now for about 4 or 5 years in all of our impairment rating processes. And basically, it's a simple concept. The question is, out of all of the data that should have been collected for the impairment report based on AMA guides criteria and California law, how much of the data is present? Or said another way, how much of the data is missing? So the data integrity refers to a value between 0 and 100% that allows the stakeholder reading the report to determine the accuracy, the consistency, and the reliability of the claim as it's being rated. And the real question is why? Why haven't we been doing this more often? I mean, it's basically a quality control on impairment ratings, and it also allows a measuring stick to compare one doctor's report against another. Now, part of the problem is that most of the stakeholders who are processing workers' compensation reports, they have a small or very narrow understanding about what needs to be in a report. So for instance, in a shoulder report, they might say, I think this is an acceptable result if the doctor did ranges of motion. I think this is an acceptable result if the doctor says that there was no rateable surgery. I think this is an acceptable result if an X-ray is reviewed to talk about arthritis for apportionment purposes, and so on and so on. But the problem is no one knows everything that needs to go into a report. And the problem is that everyone's looking at a report, and what's really driving the satisfaction with the report is not the content, it's the outcome. Everyone goes to the bottom, they look at the whole person impairment, and they're wanting a high value, a low value, whatever that means. But they're not really understanding what data, what foundational data was relied upon to do that report. And that's why we invented the integrity score. So the integrity score is basically going down a checklist. We know that a shoulder has to have X number of questions and findings on physical exam to be a perfect shoulder exam. Same thing with the hip, same with a psychiatric exam, same with a skin exam. Each body part has its own unique requirements for a complete rating. And when we know the checklist, we can start using the computer as an assistant to start going through the data and helping us understand what's present and what's missing. Now, when we look at impairment reports, QME reports, primary treating physician reports, really doesn't matter. No one's turning in perfect reports. But the question is, how close to perfect are they? And if you really knew how much was missing, would you be happy with the value that you're looking at on the bottom of the report? Now, this is something that's been talked about for a long time. How do we standardize impairment rating in California, and why is it a big deal? Well, the standardization is very difficult because we're looking at the majority of the stakeholders not even knowing what's supposed to be in the report to make it a perfect report. And the reason that this has so much value is because there are millions and millions of dollars in settlement each year around workers' compensation claims. And if you don't get it right, it goes into litigation. People are legitimately unhappy with the outcomes, and et cetera. So the integrity score is something that's built into every RateFast impairment report that we do. And it allows you to have instant insight into how much data is in this report and how much is missing. So the question is, why isn't this done more often? And the answer is, it's very difficult to track. Unless you have sophisticated tools that help you go through a report, understand the quality of the measurements, the details, and how much compliance there is with the AMA guides, you have no chance at understanding how much apportionment, or excuse me, how much rateable data is available in that report you're looking at. And you might be happy just to see a doctor report 6 planes of motion on a shoulder, all ending in 0s and 5s, meaning that it was visual estimates, when really they're supposed to be measured to the nearest degree, done twice, validated within 10%, and then have the opposite side done again twice, nearest degree, validated within 10%, and then you subtract the injured side from the standards of the uninjured side, and to find out what the real impairment is. And once you have that, then you have a correct and a complete report. But again, the point here is this is not being done. And there's multiple reasons why it's not being done. But again, data integrity is a built-in tool that allows you to instantly look at a report. Now, I will say, having looked at thousands and thousands of impairment reports coming through the RateFast platform, the average primary treating physician is turning in impairment reports somewhere between mid-30s and mid-50s on the completeness scores. And this is all comers: spine, shoulder, knees, ankles, skin, psych, hypertension, vision, audio, all these things, right around that range. Now, the real question is that good enough? Do we have a mandate that all integrity should be 75% or higher, or 50% or higher, or 90% or higher? And does that really affect the accuracy of the report? Yes or no? Now, one would say yes, because all rateable information should be considered when doing an impairment report. And the more information you have, the more reliable the results are from the data. So there is high value in understanding that. Now, the next thing I'm going to say is, what about QME reports? How good are they? And the QME reports are a little better, but it would surprise you. QMEs tend to run somewhere between mid-40s up to 60, but rarely do I see anything over 60 or 70% on a QME report. But people don't really understand that. And one of the unfortunate things is that most people have a bias that if the report was done by a QME, the QME report must be more accurate and more complete than what the primary treater turned in. Not necessarily the case, but that's what we think. And I brought this up in multiple video casts and podcasts in the past. People do not understand this. When a doctor goes and takes their QME exam for the state of California, there are no questions on that exam about impairment rating. None. There's some administrative questions. How soon do you have to turn in a report, and et cetera, et cetera. But there is nothing there in that QME test that standardizes or shows minimal qualifications to do impairment reports. And that's sort of a big disconnect that doesn't get talked about very, very much. So just because a case is reviewed or rated by a QME does not mean that the case is any more complete or less complete or accurate, for that matter. But the integrity value that is assigned, and the integrity value looks at all things. It looks at the completeness of the history, the completeness of the physical exam, the completeness of the diagnostic tests, and even the sub-completements of the diagnostic tests. For instance, the lumbar spine was x-rayed, but it didn't include flexion and extension views. Or you did a wrist case, but the views were not clench fist to see if there was a gap at the scapholunate, for instance. X-rays standing on the knees, AMA Guides likes you to have standing x-rays for the millimeters in joint space for the rating, although it's not required, but it is preferred. All these things are built into the integrity score. So once you know the integrity score, it helps you understand the information that was used to create the impairment report that you're looking at. And at RateFast, we believe that that's pretty important. Now, The question also, once you understand the impairment report and you understand the integrity score, you can write an intelligent letter or have an intelligent response or opinion of the report that you can't have unless you know the integrity score and the things that make up the integrity data that's being looked at. So for instance, if you are looking at a shoulder rating and you see that the shoulder rating was 6%, but you look at the doctor's report and you look at the integrity score and you say, well, this integrity score came in at 45%, and it got points off because it did not, was not measured with a goniometer. They did not do opposite sides. They only did 4 planes of motion. They didn't do 6. And so now when you're setting out to repair the QME report, okay, instead of getting the letter to the doctor that the doctor usually gets, whether you're a primary treater or a QME, okay, the standard letter right now, when people are in the dark and don't really understand these things, the standard letter is, Dear Dr. Alchemy, you created an impairment report on Mr. Smith, and you gave him 6% whole person impairment in the shoulder. Can you explain how you arrived at the 6%? Those are the letters that get written. And as soon as I see a letter drafted like that, I know that the author does not have a firm grasp on the AMA guides or impairment values. They're just unhappy with the value of the whole person impairment. And that's sort of a giveaway. Now, contrast that to a letter from the stakeholder who writes and says, Dr. Alchemy, you did Mr. Smith's shoulders. You arrived at a 6%. However, in the report, I noticed that you did visual estimates and only did 3 planes of motion. I would ask that you please bring the patient back. Please do 6 planes of motion, each shoulder to the nearest degree with the goniometer. And that is a very, very different letter than one just saying, how did you get to 6%? Because all I'm going to tell you is, here's how I got to 6%. I'm not going to tell you that, oh, I should have done both sides. I should have done 6 planes. I should have used a goniometer to the nearest degree. But when you have the understanding of the integrity score is simply a scorecard. It's a grade. It's a way of looking at the data and saying, you know, these things are missing, you know, and are these things that mean enough to me as a stakeholder that I want to raise them or not? That's up to the stakeholder if they're happy with the value they have, but they need to understand how much data was used for that impairment rating. So like I said, there is no rule, there is no standard for the integrity score on an impairment report in California. It just doesn't exist. But part of the reason it hasn't existed is because no one's digitized it to the point of RateFast that we can actually look at a number and we can compare it and we can understand why the integrity score is low and know exactly what's missing. And the whole point is that we created the integrity score for transparency. So if you have a case and you're going to be settling it on 15% whole person impairment, at least your eyes are open and you know that it's being settled on a 45% integrity score, or the x-rays were not done standing, or the ranges of motion were not done 3 times. But, you know, that's up to you. But we believe that you should at least have information and make an informed decision that if you're going to settle this case, whether you're the patient, an attorney, insurance company, a self-insured employer, or even a judge looking at the legality of the case, you should be given as much information and insight into the data that was used as possible to allow you to make that decision. So that is the presentation, the discussion today about RateFast and integrity data. I want everyone to kind of think about that next time you look at an impairment report. Look at that and really say, how much of this data is really rateable, and how accurate and complete and in compliance is it with the AMA guides? And hopefully you won't be thinking, you know what? I've been looking at impairment ratings and really not even understanding what it's based on, other than some basic ideas that I think should be in an impairment report, but it's not necessarily what the law or the AMA guides say should be there. So again, Dr. John Alchemy with RateFast. We're talking about integrity scores. It's the foundational score that tells you and communicates how much data is present and was present and is being used for the impairment report at the bottom of your report. And you're only going to find this in RateFast impairment reports. I hope I've given you something interesting to think about, and we'll look forward to joining you next time on our next topic. Again, Dr. John Alchemy with RateFast.